when I look at the 3 massive manuscript volumes which contain our work for the year 1894, I confess that it is very difficult for me, out of such a wealth of material, to select the cases which are most interesting in themselves, and at the same time most conducive to a display of those peculiar powers for which my friend was famous. As I turn over the pages, I see my notes upon the repulsive story of the Red Leech and the terrible death of Crosby, the banker. The famous Smith-Mortimer succession case comes also within this period, and so does the tracking and arrest of Hure, the boulevard assassin, an exploit which won for Holmes an autograph letter of thanks from the French President and the Order of the Legion of Honor. Each of these would furnish a narrative, but on the whole I am of opinion that none of them unites so many singular points of interest as the episode of Yoxley Old Place, which includes not only the lamentable death of young Willoughby Smith, but also those subsequent developments which threw so curious a light upon the causes of the crime. Holmes and I sat together in silence all the evening, he engaged with a powerful lens, deciphering the remains of the original inscription upon a palimpsest, I deep in a recent treatise upon surgery. Outside the wind howled down Baker Street, while the rain beat fiercely against the windows. It was strange there, in the very depths of the town, with 10 miles of man's handiwork on every side of us, to feel the iron grip of nature, and to be conscious that to the huge elemental forces all London was no more than the molehills that dot the fields. I walked to the window and looked out on the deserted street. "Well, Watson, it's as well we have not to turn out tonight," said Holmes, laying aside his lens and rolling up the palimpsest. "I've done enough for one sitting. It is trying work for the eyes." So far as I can make out, it is nothing more exciting than an abbey's accounts, dating from the second half of the 15th century. Hello, 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 what's this? Amid the droning of the wind, there had come the stamping of a horse's hoofs, and the long grind of a wheel as it rasped against the curb. "What can he want?" I ejaculated as a man stepped out of it. "Want? He wants us. And we, my poor Watson, want overcoats and cravats and goloshes and every aid that man ever invented to fight the weather. Wait a bit, though. There's the cab off again. There's hope yet. He'd have kept it if he had wanted us to come. Run down, my dear fellow, and open the door, for all virtuous folk have been long in bed." When the light of the hall lamp fell upon our midnight visitor, I had no difficulty in recognizing him. It was young Stanley Hopkins, a promising detective in whose career Holmes had several times shown a very practical interest. "Come up, my dear sir," said Holmes's voice from above. "I hope you have no designs upon us, on such a night as this." The detective mounted the stairs, and our lamp gleamed upon his shining waterproof. I helped him out of it, while Holmes knocked a blaze out of the logs in the grate. Holmes and I drew closer to the fire, while the young inspector slowly and point by point developed his singular narrative. Professor Coram was still in bed, for when the weather is bad he seldom rises before midday. Willoughby Smith had been in his bedroom, which he uses as a sitting-room, but the maid heard him at that moment pass along the passage and descend to the study immediately below her. It was a wild, hoarse scream, so strange and unnatural that it might have come either from a man or a woman. The maid stood petrified for a moment, and then, recovering her courage, she ran downstairs. Inside, young Mr. Willoughby Smith was stretched upon the floor. It was pierced by a very small but very deep wound, which had divided the carotid artery. The instrument with which the injury had been inflicted lay upon the carpet beside him. It was part of the fittings of the Professor's own desk. At first the maid thought that young Smith was already dead. But on pouring some water from the carafe over his forehead, he opened his eyes for an instant. "The Professor," he murmured. "It was she." The maid is prepared to swear that those were the exact words. He tried desperately to say something else, and he held his right hand up in the air. Then he fell back dead. In the meantime the housekeeper had also arrived upon the scene, but she was just too late to catch the young man's dying words. Leaving Susan with the body, she hurried to the Professor's room. Mrs. Marker is prepared to swear that the Professor was still in his night-clothes, and indeed it was impossible for him to dress without the help of Mortimer, whose orders were to come at 12 o'clock. The Professor declares that he heard the distant cry, but that he knows nothing more. He can give no explanation of the young man's last words. The Professor, it was she, but imagines that they were the outcome of delirium. His first action was to send Mortimer, the gardener, for the local police. Nothing was moved before I got there, and strict orders were given that no one should walk upon the paths leading to the house. It was a splendid chance of putting your theories into practice, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. "Except Mr. Sherlock Holmes," said my companion, with a somewhat bitter smile. "Well, let us hear about it. What sort of a job did you make of it?" "I must ask you first, Mr. Holmes, to glance at this rough plan, which will give you a general idea of the position of the Professor's study and the various points of the case." I rose and, standing behind Holmes, studied it over his shoulder. "It is very rough, of course, and it only deals with the points which seem to me to be essential. Now, first of all, presuming that the assassin entered the house, how did he or she come in?" "Undoubtedly by the garden path and the back door, from which there is direct access to the study. The escape must have also been made along that line, for of the two other exits from the room, one was blocked by Susan as she ran downstairs, and the other leads straight to the Professor's bedroom. There could be no question, however, that someone had passed along the grass border which lines the path, and that he had done so in order to avoid leaving a track. I could not find anything in the nature of a distinct impression, but the grass was trodden down, and someone had undoubtedly passed. It could only have been the murderer, since neither the gardener nor anyone else had been there that morning, and the rain had only begun during the night. Where does this path lead to?" "To the road." "How long is it?" 100 yards or so." "At the point where the path passes through the gate, you could surely pick up the tracks." "Unfortunately, the path was tiled at that point." "Well, on the road itself?" "No, it was all trodden into mire." "Tut, tut. Well, then, these tracks upon the grass, were they coming or going?" "It was impossible to say." "A large foot or a small?" "You could not distinguish." Holmes gave an ejaculation of impatience. "It has been pouring rain and blowing a hurricane ever since," said he. "It will be harder to read now than that palimpsest. What did you do, Hopkins, after you had made certain that you had made certain of nothing?" "I think I made certain of a good deal, Mr. Holmes. I knew that someone had entered the house cautiously from without. I next examined the corridor. It is lined with coconut matting, and had taken no impression of any kind. The main article is a large writing table with a fixed bureau. This bureau consists of a double column of drawers with a central small cupboard between them. The drawers, it seems, were always open, and nothing of value was kept in them. There were some papers of importance in the cupboard, but there were no signs that this had been tampered with, and the Professor assures me that nothing was missing. I come now to the body of the young man. It was found near the bureau, and just to the left of it, as marked upon that chart. The stab was on the right side of the neck, and from behind forward, so that it is almost impossible that it could have been self-inflicted. "Unless he fell upon the knife," said Holmes. "Exactly. The idea crossed my mind. But we found the knife some feet away from the body, so that seems impossible. Then, of course, there are the man's own dying words. And finally, there was this very important piece of evidence, which was found clasped in the dead man's right hand." From his pocket, Stanley Hopkins drew a small paper packet. He unfolded it and disclosed a golden pince-nez, with 2 broken ends of black silk cord dangling from the end of it. "Willoughby Smith had excellent sight," he added. "There can be no question that this was snatched from the face or the person of the assassin." Sherlock Holmes took the glasses into his hand and examined them with the utmost attention and interest. He held them on his nose, endeavoured to read through them, went to the window and stared up the street with them, looked at them most minutely in the full light of the lamp, and finally, with a chuckle, seated himself at the table and wrote a few lines upon a sheet of paper, which he tossed across to Stanley Hopkins. "That's the best I can do for you," said he. "It may prove to be of some use." The astonished detective read the note aloud. It ran as follows: "Wanted, a woman of good address, attired like a lady. She has a remarkably thick nose, with eyes which are set close upon either side of it. She has a puckered forehead, a peering expression, and probably rounded shoulders. There are indications that she has had recourse to an optician at least twice during the last few months. As her glasses are of remarkable strength, and as opticians are not very numerous, there should be no difficulty in tracing her." Holmes smiled at the astonishment of Hopkins, which must have been reflected upon my features. "Surely my deductions are simplicity itself," said he. "You will perceive," he said, "that the clips are lined with tiny bands of cork to soften the pressure upon the nose. One of these is discoloured and worn to some slight extent, but the other is new. Evidently one has fallen off and been replaced. I should judge that the older of them has not been there more than a few months. They exactly correspond, so I gather that the lady went back to the same establishment for the second." "By George, it's marvellous!" cried Hopkins, in an ecstasy of admiration. We saw the cold winter sun rise over the dreary marshes of the Thames, and the long sullen reaches of the river, which I shall ever associate with our pursuit of the Andaman Islander in the earlier days of our career. After a long and weary journey, we alighted at a small station some miles from Chatham. While a horse was being put into a trap at the local inn, we snatched a hurried breakfast, and so we were all ready for business when we at last arrived at Yoxley Old Place. Our lady must have picked her steps carefully, must she not, since on the one side she would leave a track on the path, and on the other an even clearer one on the soft bed. Yes, sir, she must have been a cool hand. I saw an intent look pass over Holmes's face. "I noticed it, Mr. Holmes, but you'll always find scratches round a keyhole." "This is recent, quite recent. See how the brass shines where it is cut. An old scratch would be the same colour as the surface. Look at it through my lens. There's the varnish, too, like earth on each side of a furrow. Is Mrs. Marker there?" A sad-faced elderly woman came into the room. At the end was a short flight of steps ending in a door. Our guide knocked and then ushered us into the professor's bedroom. It was a very large chamber, lined with innumerable volumes, which had overflowed from the shelves and lay in piles in the corners, or were stacked all round at the base of the cases. The bed was in the centre of the room, and in it, propped up with pillows, was the owner of the house. I have seldom seen a more remarkable-looking person. It was a gaunt, aquiline face which was turned towards us, with piercing dark eyes, which lurked in deep hollows under overhung and tufted brows. His hair and beard were white, save that the latter was curiously stained with yellow around his mouth. A cigarette glowed amid the tangle of white hair, and the air of the room was fetid with stale tobacco smoke. As he held out his hand to Holmes, I perceived that it was also stained with yellow nicotine. "A smoker, Mr. Holmes?" said he, speaking in well-chosen English, with a curious little mincing accent. "Pray, take a cigarette, and you, sir. I can recommend them, for I have them especially prepared by Ionides of Alexandria. He sends me 1,000 at a time, and I grieve to say that I have to arrange for a fresh supply every fortnight. Bad, sir, very bad, but an old man has few pleasures. Tobacco and my work, that is all that is left to me." Holmes had lit a cigarette, and was shooting little darting glances all over the room. "Tobacco and my work, but now only tobacco," the old man exclaimed. I observed that he was smoking with extraordinary rapidity. It was evident that he shared our host's liking for the fresh Alexandrian cigarettes. "Yes, sir, it is a crushing blow," said the old man. "That is my magnum opus, the pile of papers on the side table yonder. It is my analysis of the documents found in the Coptic monasteries of Syria and Egypt, a work which will cut deep at the very foundation of revealed religion. With my enfeebled health, I do not know whether I shall ever be able to complete it, now that my assistant has been taken from me. Dear me, Mr. Holmes, why, you are even a quicker smoker than I am myself." Holmes smiled. "I am a connoisseur," said he, taking another cigarette from the box, his fourth, and lighting it from the stub of that which he had finished. "Tell me, Professor Coram," he said at last, "what is in that cupboard in the bureau?" "Nothing that would help a thief. Family papers, letters from my poor wife, diplomas of universities which have done me honour. Here is the key. You can look for yourself." Holmes picked up the key and looked at it for an instant, then handed it back. "I should prefer to go quietly down to your garden and turn the whole matter over in my head. There is something to be said for the theory of suicide which you have put forward. We must apologize for having intruded upon you, Professor Coram, and I promise that we won't disturb you until after lunch. At 2 o'clock we will come again, and report to you anything which may have happened in the interval." Holmes was curiously distrait, and we walked up and down the garden path for some time in silence. "It depends upon those cigarettes that I smoked," said he. "It is possible that I am utterly mistaken. The cigarettes will show me." "My dear Holmes," I exclaimed, "how on earth—" "Well, well, you may see for yourself. If not, there's no harm done. Of course, we always have the optician clue to fall back upon, but I take a short cut when I can get it. Ah, here is the good Mrs. Marker. Let us enjoy 5 minutes of instructive conversation with her." I may have remarked before that Holmes had, when he liked, a peculiarly ingratiating way with women, and that he very readily established terms of confidence with them. Stanley Hopkins had gone down to the village to look into some rumours of a strange woman who had been seen by some children on the Chatham road the previous morning. I had never known him handle a case in such a half-hearted fashion. Even the news brought back by Hopkins that he had found the children, and that they had undoubtedly seen a woman exactly corresponding with Holmes's description, and wearing either spectacles or eyeglasses, failed to rouse any sign of keen interest. He was more attentive when Susan, who waited upon us at lunch, volunteered the information that she believed Mr. Smith had been out for a walk yesterday morning, and that he had only returned half an hour before the tragedy occurred. I could not myself see the bearing of this incident, but I clearly perceived that Holmes was weaving it into the general scheme which he had formed in his brain. We must go up and have it out with our friend the Professor. The old man had just finished his lunch, and certainly his empty dish bore evidence to the good appetite with which the housekeeper had credited him. He was indeed a weird figure as he turned his white mane and his glowing eyes towards us. "Well, Mr. Holmes, have you solved this mystery yet?" He shoved the large tin of cigarettes, which stood on a table beside him, towards my companion. Holmes stretched out his hand at the same moment, and between them they tipped the box over the edge. For a minute or two we were all on our knees, retrieving stray cigarettes from impossible places. Something like a sneer quivered over the gaunt features of the old professor. "Indeed, in the garden?" "No, here." "Here? When?" "This instant." "You are surely joking, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. You compel me to tell you that this is too serious a matter to be treated in such a fashion. I have forged and tested every link of my chain, Professor Coram, and I am sure that it is sound. What your motives are, or what exact part you play in this strange business, I am not yet able to say. In a few minutes I shall probably hear it from your own lips. Meanwhile I will reconstruct what is past for your benefit, so that you may know the information which I still require. A lady yesterday entered your study. She came with the intention of possessing herself of certain documents which were in your bureau. I have had an opportunity of examining yours, and I do not find that slight discoloration which the scratch made upon the varnish would have produced. She mounted a stair, pushed open a door, and found herself in your room. The old man sat with his mouth open, staring wildly at Holmes. Amazement and fear were stamped upon his expressive features. "All very fine, Mr. Holmes," said he. "I was myself in my room, and I never left it during the day." "And you mean to say that I could lie upon that bed and not be aware that a woman had entered my room?" "I never said so." Again the professor burst into high-keyed laughter. "I helped her to escape? Where is she now?" "She is there," said Holmes. And he pointed to a high bookcase in the corner of the room. I saw the old man throw up his arms. A terrible convulsion passed over his grim face, and he fell back in his chair. At the same instant the bookcase at which Holmes pointed swung round upon a hinge, and a woman rushed out into the room. Her face, too, was streaked with grime, and at the best she could never have been handsome, for she had the exact physical characteristics which Holmes had divined, with, in addition, a long and obstinate chin. Stanley Hopkins had laid his arm upon her arm and claimed her as his prisoner, but she waved him aside gently, and yet with an overmastering dignity which compelled obedience. The old man lay back in his chair with a twitching face, and stared at her with brooding eyes. "From where I stood, I could hear everything, and I know that you have learned the truth." I confess it all. It was I who killed the young man. But you are right, you who say it was an accident. I did not even know that it was a knife which I held in my hand. For in my despair I snatched anything from the table and struck at him to make him let me go. It is the truth that I tell. Madam, said Holmes, I am sure that it is the truth. I fear that you are far from well. She had turned a dreadful colour, the more ghastly under the dark dust streaks upon her face. She seated herself on the side of the bed. Then she resumed. I have only a little time here, she said, but I would have you to know the whole truth. I am this man's wife. He is not an Englishman. He is a Russian. His name I will not tell. For the first time the old man stirred. God bless you, Anna, he cried. God bless you. She cast a look of the deepest disdain in his direction. Why should you cling so hard to that wretched life of yours, Sergius? Said she. It has done harm to many and good to none, not even to yourself. However, it is not for me to cause the frail thread to be snapped before God's time. I have enough already upon my soul, since I crossed the threshold of this cursed house. But I must speak, or I shall be too late. I have said, gentlemen, that I am this man's wife. He was 50 and I a foolish girl of 20 when we married. It was in a city of Russia, a university. I will not name the place. God bless you, Anna, murmured the old man again. We were reformers, revolutionists, nihilists, you understand. Then there came a time of trouble. A police officer killed, many were arrested, evidence was wanted, and in order to save his own life and to earn a great reward, my husband betrayed his own wife and his companions. Some of us found our way to the gallows and some to Siberia. I was among these last, but my term was not for life. My husband came to England with his ill-gotten gains and has lived in quiet ever since, knowing well that if the Brotherhood knew where he was, not a week would pass before justice would be done. The old man reached out a trembling hand and helped himself to a cigarette. I have not yet told you the height of his villainy, said she. Among our comrades of the order, there was one who was the friend of my heart. He was noble, unselfish, loving, all that my husband was not. So would my diary, in which from day to day I had entered both my feelings towards him and the view which each of us had taken. He hid them, and he tried hard to swear away the young man's life. In this he failed. But Alexis was sent a convict to Siberia, where now at this moment he works in a salt mine. Think of that, you villain, you villain! Now at this very moment, Alexis, a man whose name you are not worthy to speak, works and lives like a slave, and yet I have your life in my hands, and I let you go. You were always a noble woman, Anna, said the old man, puffing at his cigarette. She had risen, but she fell back again with a little cry of pain. I must finish, she said. When my term was over, I set myself to get the diary and letters, which, if sent to the Russian government, would procure my friend's release. After months of searching, I discovered where he was. I knew that he still had the diary, for when I was in Serbia, I had a letter from him once, reproaching me and quoting some passages from its pages. I was sure that, with his revengeful nature, he would never give it to me of his own free will. With this object I engaged an agent from a private detective firm who entered my husband's house as a secretary. It was your second secretary, Sergius, the one who left you so hurriedly. He found that papers were kept in the cupboard, and he got an impression of the key. He furnished me with a plan of the house, and he told me that in the forenoon the study was always empty, as the secretary was employed up here. So at last I took my courage in both hands, and I came down to get the papers for myself. I succeeded, but at what cost? I had just taken the paper and was locking the cupboard when the young man seized me. I had seen him already that morning. He had met me on the road, and I had asked him to tell me where Professor Coram lived, not knowing that he was in his employ. Exactly, said Holmes. The secretary came back and told his employer of the woman he had met. Then, in his last breath, he tried to send a message that it was she, the she whom he had just discussed with him. "You must let me speak," said the woman in an imperative voice, and her face contracted as if in pain. "These are my last words," said she. "Here is the packet which will save Alexis. I confide it to your honor and to your love of justice. Take it. You will deliver it at the Russian embassy. Now I have done my duty and—" "Stop her!" cried Holmes. He had bounded across the room and had wrenched a small phial from her hand. "Too late," she said, sinking back on the bed. "Too late. I took the poison before I left my hiding-place. My head swims. I am going. I charge you, sir, to remember the packet." "A simple case, and yet in some ways an instructive one," Holmes remarked as we travelled back to town.
Thank you for watching this video. Please like, share and subscribe to the channel to see the latest videos. Thank you.